In April 1945, the BBC broadcast a report that chilled the blood of television viewers. The story in question had its origin in Germany, in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, which was one of the most important of the Third Reich. Journalists had recorded the moment when Allied troops arrived at the site and found thousands of bodies piled up on the ground, unburied, rotting in the open. In a quavering voice, the BBC announcer described the scene as follows: "Here, on this piece of land, lie the dead and dying, the living resting their heads on the corpses. Among them move emaciated people who look like ghosts, who haven't eaten for months, walking aimlessly, with their eyes lost on the horizon. Babies were born in this place, but these poor creatures had no chance of surviving in these conditions." A maddened mother yelled at our English soldiers to give her a bottle of milk for her child, but the child in question had been dead for days in his crib. Rarely had the British population encountered such horror. Immediately, they began to wonder who was responsible for this barbarity and when they would have to pay the consequences. The answer to these questions came a few months later, when the Allies arrested Bergen-Belsen's commanding personnel and put them on trial. It was then that the truth came out: many of the murders had been committed by young women affiliated with Nazism. Beneath the apparent innocence of his youth, lurked monsters capable of subjecting prisoners to hell. Do not move from your screen, because in the next few minutes we'll tell you the story of these women and the punishment they received for their crimes. The Bergen-Belsen camp opened its doors in 1940 in northern Germany, and in its beginnings it was designed to contain prisoners of war from the Allied countries. However, shortly after the SS took control of the site and decided to modify its functions. From this moment on, it began to house Jews, political opponents of Nazism, Gypsies, and Slavs. Inside the camp, the different groups were divided according to their origin, so that the Jews were separated into one camp for those who came from Poland, another for those from the Netherlands, and another for those of Hungarian descent. The same criteria was used to divide the other communities. As in all concentration centers, the inmates were forced to perform forced labor to help German industry. In the case of Bergen-Belsen, they had to work as slaves in a leather recycling factory, where each person was given shoes from which the reusable material had to be removed. In August 1944, the establishment began to receive women. Thousands of young people, adults, and old women were confined inside, and it is known that Anne Frank found her end here. The female population of the camp was subjected to the same deplorable conditions as the male. Most of the problems were caused by overcrowding. Bergen-Belsen was full, and there was no room to accommodate more people. This, however, was not an inconvenience for the Nazi hierarchs, who did not care about the comfort of the prisoners and even enjoyed seeing them suffer. Soon the food available to the inmates ran out, and those who did not die of malnutrition were stricken with terrible diseases. Dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis spread among the prisoners and decimated their numbers. Faced with the catastrophe, the reaction of the Nazi guards was to execute the inmates, with the aim of eliminating the human surplus and restoring balance. In April 1945, with Nazi Germany almost defeated, British troops arrived at the Bergen-Belsen camp. As we told you at the beginning of the video, when they entered they found 13,000 unburied bodies and 60,000 inmates starving and on the verge of death. The staff who managed the establishment were arrested and taken into custody until, 5 months later, the trial began to determine who had been guilty of the crimes committed there. Beginning in September 1945, dozens of SS members were questioned by prosecutors. Those who witnessed the event were shocked to see that those responsible for a large part of the crimes were young women. One of them was Irma Gries, just 22 years old, who had earned the nicknames the Beast of Belsen and the Hyena of Auschwitz. Gries had worked as a prison guard in several concentration camps, and in all of them she displayed the same sociopathic behavior. She was personally in charge of choosing those destined for the gas chambers, and on occasion she beat defenseless inmates to death with her bare hands. One of her favorite pastimes was to unleash hungry dogs on her victims, who were torn to pieces by the animals. Another of Bergen-Belsen's prominent torturers was Elisabeth Volkenrath, 26. who had commanded the women's section of Auschwitz, in her record. She liked to play with the lives of the prisoners, whom she subjected to torture, beatings, and executions. According to certain witnesses, she had gone so far as to kill an old woman by pushing her down a staircase. Among the defendants in the trial, there was also Johanna Bormann, known as the Woman of the Dogs, since she shared the same passion as Irma Gries for letting the inmates be devoured by her dogs. The jury ruled that the crimes were so heinous that they deserved the death penalty. 10 other SS guards, however, were sentenced to prison, as there was insufficient evidence against them. On December 13, 1945, the scaffold was prepared for Gries, Volkenrath, and Bormann to take their last steps. The person in charge of the execution was Albert Pierrepoint, a professional executioner who had the habit of interviewing the sentenced and taking their body measurements, to calculate the exact length of the rope that was to hang them. In his memoirs, Pierrepoint gives details of what the meeting with each of the women was like. Her brief moment with Irma Gries went as follows. When we opened her cell, she came up to us laughing. She looked like the type of girl you want to date. She answered all the questions I asked her, but when I wanted to know how old she was, she kept quiet and looked at me with a knowing smile. At that moment I realized that asking a woman how old she is was awkward and impolite, although she finally answered. After taking her measurements, at 9:34 in the morning, she entered the execution room and walked to the center of her scaffold. There was a chalk mark indicating where she should stand. We put a white hood over her head and wound the noose around her neck. The last thing Irma said was schnell, which in German means fast. The trap opened and within a few minutes, the doctor pronounced her dead. 30 minutes later it was the turn of Elisabeth Volkenrath, who until the last minute denied having participated in the crimes of Bergen-Belsen or having any knowledge of the Holocaust. At 10:04 in the morning the gallows did their duty and broke Volkenrath's neck. Half an hour later, the guards led Johanna Bormann to her scaffold. The woman was 52 years old and her health was failing, as she limped noticeably. The last thing she said before she died was, "I have feelings too." This is how the story of these women came to an end, who went down in history as the cruelest of the Third Reich. Although the victims could in no way be compensated for their suffering, the sentences served to show them that there was still justice in the world.
I remember one of the guards, Dorothea Binns, walking through the camp. I can still see her before my eyes. The day when an exhausted prisoner passed by her, stumbled, and fell is etched in my memory. With great effort, she got up and staggered away. Such a scene was enough for Dorothea, who called the dogs and set them upon the helpless inmate. They were wild, fierce beasts, trained specifically to tear apart the victim until they ceased to breathe. This is the testimony of Olga Golovina, a survivor of Ravensbrook, a concentration camp notable for being exclusively for women. Here, the female guards had free rein to indulge their darkest impulses. The result was an array of aberrant tortures, ranging from simple yet forceful beatings to dismemberment with axes. Eventually, the bloodbath came to an end with the conclusion of the Second World War, and those responsible for the atrocities received their just punishment. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the executions of the guards of Ravensbrook. Ravensbrook began official operations in May 1939. Its construction was ordered by Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, to have a place to house the female population. The camp was located in northern Germany, just 90 kilometers from the city of Berlin. Initially, around 2,000 women accused of opposing Hitler's regime were imprisoned there, among whom was a group of 50 Jehovah's Witnesses. They had been arrested for distributing propaganda, claiming that the Führer was the incarnation of the Antichrist. Their audacity had cost them their freedom. Other prisoners included communists and former members of the Reichstag, the German parliament. although not only political enemies of Nazism were taken there. Prostitutes, gypsies, criminals, and homosexuals were also considered dangerous to German society, and therefore were sent to the camp. The population of the facility increased to the point that just 8 months after the start of the Second World War, its maximum capacity had already been exceeded. The inmates lived crowded in dirty barracks, dressed in rags, starved and ravaged by diseases. Let's hear the testimony of N4ZI, who was sent to Ravensbrook for being part of the French resistance. She remembers her first impression upon entering the site. Seeing those disfigured gray women with vacant stares scared us. Suddenly, we felt that we were entering a zone of death. On the other hand, the site was notable for the fact that there were 150 female guards, whose job was to supervise the inmates and ensure that they maintained order. Like in other concentration camps, the guards were trained to rid themselves of their feelings. They had to harden their hearts and see the prisoners as beasts to whom no mercy should be shown. A survivor of the camp describes it this way: "They didn't shoot the women, instead they aimed to make us die of sorrow, hunger, and exhaustion." When we arrived at Ravensbrook, the first thing I saw was a cart full of stacked corpses. Their arms and legs hung outward, and they had their eyes and mouths open in a grimace of horror. They dehumanized us. We felt that even cattle had more value than us. The guards were not only complicit in everything that happened there, but often directly responsible for the abuses. One of the most hated was Emma Zimmer, who began working in the camp in 1939, shortly after its opening. She was one of those responsible for selecting the women who would go to the gas chambers, which made her the target of hatred from the inmates. A survivor remembers her as follows: "She was a wicked old SS, accustomed to frightening us with her threats. With her sadistic tone of voice, she would say things like, for example, 'I will report you and then you will go far away. Do you know where? You will be ash in the chimney.' We feared her and at the same time detested her." Another guard was Greta Buzel, known for her absolute lack of empathy with the prisoners. On one occasion, she was heard saying the following: "If any of the prisoners are too tired to work, they should be sent to rot." Interestingly, she had studied to be a nurse and help others, but fate led her to work in a concentration camp where her task was to prepare women to die poisoned with the lethal gas Zyklon B. However, the most hated guard in Ravensbrook was Dorothea Benz, a woman whose cruelty exceeded all imaginable limits. She entered the camp for the first time in 1939 after volunteering to work in the kitchen. At that time, she was 21 years old, and no one suspected that a young woman with such an innocent appearance would become a true monster. In late summer 1940, she was promoted to the position of subdirector of a cell block, which meant that the inmates were at her disposal. It was at that moment that she unleashed her cruelest side and acquired the taste for savagely beating the prisoners until they were on the brink of death. In 1944, her inhumanity was rewarded with a new promotion, this time to the position of Oberaufseherin, meaning chief supervisor of the concentration camp. Her power was absolute, and although she had other direct superiors she had to obey, the truth is that she was allowed to do as she pleased. Dorothea would inspect the prisoners twice a day. The women had to line up in the courtyard for hours without being able to move, regardless of whether it was sweltering hot, bitterly cold, pouring rain, or they were exhausted from hunger. They couldn't speak, sit, look at each other, and certainly not gaze upon the guards. The process lasted a couple of hours until every inmate had been called by name to confirm their presence and prove that none had escaped. The photograph you are currently seeing shows Dorothea in her work uniform, standing next to her gigantic German Shepherd. The dog was trained to attack at the signal of the supervisor, something that, as we saw at the beginning of the video, happened frequently. Binz had little patience for those who broke the rules, no matter how insignificant the infraction. A woman with improperly fastened clothes, or who accidentally dropped a crust of bread to the ground, could receive dozens of lashes as punishment. Dorothea used to walk with a whip in one hand, scanning the prisoners from head to toe, looking for any excuse to strike them. Next, we will hear the testimony of Dagmar Hajkova, a Czech survivor of Ravensbrook, who witnessed one of the supervisor's most brutal crimes. Dorothea noticed a woman she thought wasn't working hard enough. She approached her and slapped her to the ground. Then she took an axe and started hacking at the inmate, until her lifeless body was nothing but a bloody mass. When she finished, Dorothea wiped her shiny boots with a dry piece of the corpse's skirt. She mounted her bicycle and pedaled back to her quarters unhurriedly as if nothing had happened. The guards continued to behave like angels of death throughout the war, although their reign of terror was approaching its catastrophic end. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich was cornered, the Red Army of the Soviet Union launched a sweeping advance into German territory. On April 30th of that year, they reached Ravensbrook and liberated the 3,000 survivors who were still imprisoned there. In the following weeks, the camp guards were identified and arrested by the Allies. Immediately, a trial against them began. Evidence of their crimes was collected, and witnesses who could testify to the abuses were sought. Greta Bösel and Emma Zimmer, whom we mentioned earlier, were found guilty of committing war crimes related to the mistreatment of prisoners. They were executed by hanging on May 3, 1947, and September 20, 1948, respectively. The fate of Dorothea Binz, the all-powerful supervisor of the concentration camp, would not be much different. In April 1945, upon learning that the Soviets were approaching her position, she decided to escape on her own. She was aware that if the Russians caught her, she could consider herself dead, so she risked everything in a desperate escape. She only made it to Hamburg, where she was quickly identified by a patrol of the British Army and taken into custody. The trial against Dorothea and other officers of Ravensbrook lasted 2 years, and in the end, the former supervisor was sentenced to death by hanging. What you are seeing now is the filmed record of the moment when the accused heard their final sentence. There, identified with a sign bearing the number 5, was Binz. In April 1947, while awaiting death, Dorothea attempted suicide by cutting her veins. However, she was saved by the guards who intervened just in time to prevent her from escaping justice. On May 2nd of that year, she was led to the gallows, where she was forced to stand on the trap door. A black hood was placed over her face and the noose was tightened around her neck. Then, the executioner activated the mechanism. Dorothea Binz fell through the hole, and her neck broke instantly. Thus, the story of the torturers of Ravensbrook reached its grim conclusion. Not all of Adolf Hitler's executioners and those of the Nazi dictatorship were men, but there were many women co-opted by the National Socialist ideology who followed the horrific orders of the regime without questioning them. However, among all the sadists who patrolled the streets of the largest concentration camp in history, Maria Mandel stood out. None of the prisoners under her command dared to look her directly in the eyes or to stop doing their work, much less to contradict her orders, since doing so meant an unbearable death. In this video, we will tell you the story of a brutal and bestial woman who ended the lives of more than 500,000 people, including women and children. Welcome to Military History. January 10, 1912, is a date marked in red on the calendar of 20th century history. That is the birth date of Maria Mandel, infamously known as the SS Lagerführerin, which is what women leaders of zones were called in the terrifying Auschwitz II extermination camp. Who would later be known as the Beast of Auschwitz, was born in Münzkirchen, a small Austrian village, into a modest family dedicated to shoemaking. After completing her studies in her city, Maria moved to study at a Bergerschule, a kind of center where students were prepared for commercial and craft tasks. There, Maria enjoyed great popularity thanks to her undeniable beauty. After a series of job failures, Maria finally found work in October 1938, thanks to a relative who worked for the Führer's regime. The young woman was hired as a guard at the incipient internment center of Lichtenberg, one of the first Nazi concentration camps. When this sinister establishment became too small to accommodate the large number of arriving prisoners, the Ravensbrook camp was built in 1939, which was reserved only for women, an ideal space for the beast to feed and grow. In Ravensbrook is where she began to earn her perverse fame due to the inhumane treatment she subjected the inmates to. Although her job consisted of training other companions in administrative tasks, Maria Mandel wanted to be at the forefront of cruelty. This place represented the first step on the path this woman took to perpetrate the most macabre humiliations, tortures, and crimes that the average human mind can imagine. In the camp, Mandel was in charge of the daily routine of the inmates, and those who did not withstand the exhausting sessions were transferred to the punishment bunker, where they were humiliated and punished. In these torturous sessions, they were subjected to all kinds of floggings in batches of 25, 50, 75, and 100 blows each, until they collapsed, victims of exhaustion. During the punishment, they were forced to count aloud, although none ever reached 10. The culmination of these acts of sadism occurred when Maria stood in front of the inmates waiting for someone to dare to look at her. According to a survivor of the camp, she was capable of staring at you for hours, trying to break you. Anyone who broke the rule and looked up disappeared. We never heard from her again. From the gas chamber, she went straight to the crematory oven without anyone being able to say goodbye to her. It was even said that sometimes she sent them straight to the oven. After impressing her superiors with her brutal methods, Maria was promoted to female SS guard with extermination rank, nothing less than in Auschwitz. It was there that she truly lived up to her nickname, unleashing her cruelty and deploying all her potential for evil and perversion. Maria Mandel controlled all the female camps and enjoyed absolute power over the lives of thousands and thousands of prisoners. One of her favorite tasks was to select the inmates who were to be executed in the gas chambers and which ones were to be destined for forced labor. In the case of the latter, she only spared their lives for amusement, like a predator playing with its prey, knowing perfectly well that if the prisoners were not eliminated at that moment, they would be in the near future. Many times, these women who were spared became something very much like pets, or as Mandel called them, Jewish pets. For a period of time, she would sponsor and consider them, until finally opting to eliminate them as coldly as the others. Interestingly, one of the concerns of the Beast of Auschwitz was the cleanliness of the camp's prisoners. For example, after each execution, the prisoners' uniforms were not incinerated along with the corpses, but were reused to be worn by other inmates. Not burning them helped avoid toxic fumes in the chimneys, which the prisoners of the extermination camp would have breathed. More than an act of humanity, it was sadism of Maria Mandel, since this act, in her own words, was to keep the prisoners alive to amuse myself later. The Beast of Auschwitz clearly savored subjecting them to the worst tortures and humiliations while they were alive. For example, the SS Lagerführerin liked to wear gloves of pristine white to see them stained red with the blood, mainly of the women flagellated by her whip, which made no distinctions between young, older girls. The fact that this satanic woman was especially ruthless with women, children, and girls was because they represented the possibility of the continuity of the Jewish lineage, and she was not going to allow it. They were an inferior race, and the anti-Jewish beast was going to make sure they knew it and eliminate them. After her transfer in 1944 to the subcamp of Mühldorf in Dachau, where she continued to perpetrate indescribable tortures and carry out her selections for the gas chamber, Maria Mandel was forced to flee with the imminent arrival of the Allies. Her plan was to return home, but after 10 days of fleeing, she was captured and interrogated by the American Army on August 10, 1945. After being detained for approximately a year, she was transferred to Poland, where she would be tried for crimes against humanity. During that trial, the voices, until then oppressed, of the inmates who had been rescued from the extermination camps where Maria Mandel had carried out her criminal abuses were heard. Without accepting the charges against her, much less assuming guilt, Mandel declared, denying all the atrocities she had committed. I had neither whip nor dog. While serving in Auschwitz, I was hindered by the terrible severity of Rudolf Höss. I was totally dependent on the commander and could not inflict any punishment. On December 22, 1947, the court handed down its verdict, and Maria Mandel was sentenced to die by hanging for murdering, torturing, and humiliating 500,000 people, including an immeasurable number of children. After her conviction, Mandel had the opportunity to repent of her crimes, with a prisoner named Stanisława Rachwałowa, a former Auschwitz prisoner who was imprisoned on charges of being a communist, in the same prison cell. The prisoner recounts that the Beast of Auschwitz asked her forgiveness for everything that had happened, but those apologies were never made public. Maria Mandel was hanged on January 24, 1948, amidst cries of "Long live Poland" at the age of 36. We are now reaching the end of this video, and we would like to ask you to leave your opinion about this sinister character in the comments below. That's it for today's video. We thank you for watching until the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.